Tonight, FBI and DEA raid CJNG Cartel empire in Atlanta. 500KG Narcotics.
On the night of Monday, federal agents executed what would become one of the largest coordinated takedowns of cartel infrastructure ever documented on the East Coast. In Atlanta, Georgia, and across 3 surrounding counties, the CJNG Cartel's most sophisticated North American distribution hub was systematically dismantled in the span of 6 hours. 580 kilograms of pure narcotics seized. $47 million in laundered cash recovered. 3 high-ranking cartel operatives arrested. But that number barely scratches the surface of what was really uncovered that night. Because hidden inside the servers and ledgers pulled from that operation was evidence of something far more dangerous than drugs moving through a city. It was proof that a cartel had done more than infiltrate a system. It had redesigned it, and the man running it all was sitting in a corner office 2 blocks from City Hall. This is what happened when the underworld stopped hiding in shadows and started wearing a badge. The raid began at 4:47 in the morning. The fog rolled thick across the industrial corridor in southeast Atlanta, turning streetlights into pale orange halos. The kind of dark that makes time feel suspended. The kind of quiet that precedes violence. 3 blocks away, at a converted grain warehouse on Sycamore Road, FBI tactical units began their final approach. No sirens. No announcements. Just the measured footsteps of 70 federal agents moving through the fog like ghosts. The DEA teams hit the front entrance simultaneously with a breaching charge that shattered the reinforced steel door. The sound echoed through the entire block. Flashbangs detonated inside, filling the warehouse with blinding white light and concussive force. Agents in full tactical gear, black helmets, assault rifles crossed to their chests, moved through the darkness in practiced formation. They knew the layout. They had watched this location for 8 months straight. They knew where the men would run, where the drugs would be hidden. What they did not know was what they were about to find beneath the concrete floor. The first level was exactly what they expected. 48 kilograms of cocaine stacked in vacuum-sealed packages behind a false wall. 32 kilograms of methamphetamine in industrial quantities. But the real discovery came when IC agents and DEA forensic specialists broke through the foundation and found the underground chamber. 280 kilograms of fentanyl. Not powder. Pressed fentanyl pills. 2.1 million individual pills, each one capable of killing a human being. The amount of fentanyl alone could have supplied the entire eastern seaboard for months. This was not a distribution point. This was a fortress. At the same moment, 40 miles north, FBI SWAT teams were breaching a luxury mansion in an exclusive subdivision outside Marietta. The second target on the strike list. They found the cartel's regional logistics coordinator, a man named Victor Delgado, trying to climb out a back window with a briefcase. Inside the briefcase were encrypted hard drives and a leather journal filled with handwritten codes. The codes were transaction records. Names, dates, amounts, authorization signatures. FBI cryptographers would spend the next 72 hours cracking what was on those drives. What they found would change everything about how they understood the operation. Simultaneously, 15 miles to the west, DEA agents and IC enforcement teams hit a commercial property registered as an agricultural equipment supplier. The warehouse doors were reinforced. Surveillance cameras covered every angle. Inside, they found 17 kilograms of heroin packed in false compartments built into shipping containers. But more critically, they discovered something that should have been impossible: a network of smuggling tunnels connecting the warehouse to 3 separate locations across 2 counties. The tunnels were reinforced with concrete, equipped with lighting systems, and designed to move products directly from distribution hubs to staging points without ever crossing above ground. This was infrastructure. This was planned. This was not the work of street-level dealers. This was the work of someone with resources, architectural expertise, and authority. By 6:30 in the morning, federal agents had seized over 500 kilograms of narcotics. They had arrested 41 individuals at those 3 locations alone. But as they were loading evidence into trucks, one DEA supervisor made a call that would shift the entire investigation. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had been working cartel cases for 19 years. He looked at the encrypted hard drives recovered from Delgado's briefcase, then looked at his team. He said 3 words: "This goes higher." The next scene shifts to 7:15 in the morning at FBI headquarters in downtown Atlanta. The Federal Cyber Forensics Lab. A room filled with 20 workstations, each one with multiple monitors casting blue light across the faces of analysts. The temperature was kept deliberately cold to protect the equipment. The sound was just the hum of machines and the occasional click of a keyboard. For 7 hours straight, FBI cryptographers worked on cracking the encryption on those hard drives. They tried standard algorithms. They tried quantum decryption protocols. By 2:47 in the afternoon, they got their first breakthrough. The first layer of encryption fell away. What they saw made one analyst stand up from their desk and walk directly to the supervisor's office without speaking. The drive contained a complete architectural map of the distribution network, but it was not mapped by geography. It was mapped by hierarchy. There were shell corporations, 32 of them, all registered in different states, all appearing to be legitimate businesses. A trucking company in Tennessee, a restaurant supply chain in Florida, a construction firm in North Carolina, a waste management service in Georgia. Each one was a front. Each one served a specific function. The trucking company moved product across state lines hidden inside shipments of merchandise. The restaurant supply chain distributed fentanyl pills through food distribution centers under the guise of vitamins and supplements. The construction firm laundered cash through renovation contracts that were never completed. The waste management service collected revenue payments from street-level dealers and moved the money through a fake recycling operation that reported millions in yearly processing fees. But there was something else embedded in the code, a master authorization signature that appeared on every transaction over $50,000. The signature was digital. It was time-stamped, and the forensic analysts traced it back to a specific IP address. The IP address belonged to a computer located in the office of the Deputy Mayor of Atlanta. His name was Samuel Weatherby. Deputy Mayor Samuel Weatherby had served in that position for 6 years. He had a reputation as a fiscal conservative. He had championed infrastructure projects. He had championed border security cooperation with the federal government. He had been interviewed twice on national cable news about immigration reform. He had also, according to the evidence now appearing on these monitors, been coordinating the most sophisticated drug distribution network ever established in the southeastern United States. The investigators pulled his records, his communications, his travel logs. The pattern emerged slowly at first, then all at once. Weatherby had used his position to reroute federal grant money through shell nonprofits that were controlled by cartel operatives. He had authorized the construction of community centers that were actually front operations for drug distribution. He had used city procurement processes to create bogus supply contracts that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent invoices. The money flowed through these contracts, was distributed to cartel handlers, and was then moved offshore through cryptocurrency exchanges. The digital trail was so complex that it would have taken traditional accountants years to trace. But it was all documented, all time-stamped, all signed with his authorization code. More critically, investigators found communications between Weatherby and a high-ranking CJNG Cartel operative named Rafael Caso. Caso was based in Guadalajara, but communicated with Weatherby via encrypted video calls every Thursday. The communications were in Spanish, but FBI translators quickly processed them. The messages were direct. Caso would send logistics updates. Weatherby would respond with law enforcement schedules, border crossing information, and operational security recommendations. He would warn them about federal investigations. He would provide them with the names of undercover agents. He would redirect police patrols away from cartel staging areas. He had essentially become a second police force, but one that worked for the cartel instead of the people. The analysts discovered something else in the financial records. A discretionary fund maintained by the deputy mayor's office that had been used to pay off law enforcement officers. 72 officers across the Atlanta Police Department and 3 surrounding sheriff's offices. They had been receiving monthly payments ranging from $5,000 to $25,000 for specific services, blocking investigations, delaying warrant executions, tipping off dealers about raids. One police captain named Thomas Reeves had received over $600,000 in the past 3 years for services that included redirecting drug seizures before they could be logged as evidence and falsifying patrol records to create false alibis for cartel members. This was not corruption. This was command-level collusion. This was not negligence. This was engineered treason at the municipal level, and it had been hidden inside the administrative systems of a major American city. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By 5 o'clock in the morning the following day, over 1,000 federal agents had been mobilized. FBI tactical teams, DEA strike forces, ICE enforcement units, DHS special operations units, 6 Black Hawk helicopters staged at 3 separate locations around the city, an armored convoy of Humvees equipped with riot control systems. The operation had a name now, Operation Redline. The goal was not just to arrest individuals. The goal was to systematically dismantle every node in the cartel's network across a 3-state region. The first phase began at dawn. Coordinated raids across 23 separate locations across Atlanta, Marietta, and surrounding areas. The deputy mayor's home was hit first. Agents breached the gate at 5:47 in the morning. They found him in his study, sitting behind his desk, a laptop open in front of him. He did not resist. He did not run. He simply closed his eyes and waited for the agents to enter. In that home, they found an additional $38 million in cash. They found encrypted communication equipment. They found photographs of cartel leaders and operational planning documents. They found evidence of his offshore accounts containing another $124 million. Simultaneously, 57 separate locations were raided. Drug warehouses in industrial corridors, trap houses in residential neighborhoods, a massage spa that served as a distribution hub for fentanyl pills, a funeral home that was actually a money laundering operation, a car wash where drug deals were finalized, an entire network of storefronts and seemingly legitimate businesses that were actually cartel operations. Agents seized an additional 230 kilograms of cocaine, 87 kilograms of heroin, and 119 kilograms of methamphetamine. They seized 74 more millions in cash. They recovered over 400 weapons. They arrested 136 individuals during that 24-hour period. But the most significant arrests came from inside law enforcement itself. Captain Thomas Reeves was arrested at his home as he was making breakfast. Detective Marcus Hayes, who had coordinated false police reports, was arrested coming out of his apartment. Lieutenant David Simmons, who had redirected drug seizures, was arrested in the parking lot of a precinct. In total, 73 law enforcement officers were arrested during Operation Redline. 22 of them held senior positions. 7 of them were commanders. 2 of them were deputy chiefs. The corruption ran so deep that entire divisions of the Atlanta Police Department were essentially compromised. What started as an investigation into drug trafficking had become an investigation into the systematic infiltration of law enforcement itself. The underworld took more damage in 24 hours than it had in the previous 6 years of continuous federal enforcement operations. But the real revelation came 3 days later when federal investigators began examining the seized servers and communication logs. They found something that made even the most experienced agents uncomfortable. A contingency plan, code-named Operation Fortress. A document written by Deputy Mayor Weatherby and transmitted to Rafael Casso detailing a long-term strategy to consolidate cartel control over the Atlanta metropolitan area to the point where the city would become functionally impossible for federal law enforcement to investigate. The plan was audacious. It outlined a 5-year expansion where cartel operatives would work to place associates in the following positions: mayor, city council members, county commissioners, judges, district attorney's office staff, state legislators, and potentially a state senator. The plan included specific strategies for funding political campaigns using shell corporations and money laundered through legitimate businesses. It included plans for hiring corporate consultants who were actually cartel operatives to advise on city policy. It included provisions for creating a law enforcement review board that would be staffed with cartel sympathizers tasked with blocking federal investigations at the municipal level. In essence, what investigators were looking at was a blueprint for taking over a major American city from the inside out. Not through violence, not through open confrontation, through quiet infiltration, through the systematic placement of operatives in every level of government and law enforcement, through the use of money and political pressure and the simple human weaknesses of ambition and greed. The deeper investigators dug, the more evidence emerged of how extensively the network had already spread. They found that Weatherby had already begun funding the political campaigns of 3 city council members, 1 county commissioner, and was in advanced discussions with a federal judge about securing his cooperation. The judge had been flagged because his adult son had substantial gambling debts. The CJNG Cartel had already paid off those debts in exchange for a promise of judicial cooperation in future cases involving cartel members. This was not just one corrupt official. This was the beginning of a system redesign. This was an attempt to rebuild the administrative and legal infrastructure of an entire metropolitan area to serve cartel interests. Federal prosecutors moved quickly. The case against Deputy Mayor Weatherby was straightforward but devastating. Racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, corruption of federal programs. Conspiracy with a known international drug trafficking organization. In total, he faced 93 separate federal charges. Conviction on even a fraction of those charges would result in a sentence of life imprisonment. When Weatherby was arraigned 3 days after his arrest, he sat in the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, looking down at the defense table, refusing to meet the eyes of anyone in that room. His public defender asked for a continuance to prepare the case. The judge denied it. He was remanded without bail pending trial. The implications rippled through law enforcement agencies across the country. If the CJNG Cartel had managed to compromise a deputy mayor in a major American city, what other cities had they targeted? What other government officials were currently on their payroll? What other police forces had been systematically infiltrated? The FBI launched national investigations into 8 additional metropolitan areas where intelligence suggested similar patterns of infiltration might be occurring. The DEA increased its focus on identifying corrupt law enforcement officers at the federal, state, and local levels. The Department of Justice announced a special task force dedicated to rooting out political and judicial corruption tied to organized crime. What investigators discovered over the following weeks expanded the scope of the conspiracy far beyond what anyone had initially anticipated. The network was not limited to Atlanta. Cartel operatives and their money had penetrated government systems in Charlotte, Nashville, Memphis, and Jacksonville. In Jacksonville, investigators found that a city councilman had been working with the CJNG Cartel to facilitate the movement of human trafficking victims through Florida ports. In Memphis, they discovered that a state legislator had been using his position to prevent federal investigations into cartel money laundering operations at several large financial institutions. In Nashville, they found that the cartel had placed operatives on the Planning Commission specifically to fast-track the construction of a massive warehouse facility designed to serve as a continental distribution hub for narcotics. The geographic scope of Operation Redline expanded. Federal agents conducted additional raids across Tennessee, Florida, and North Carolina. They seized an additional 340 kilograms of narcotics. They arrested another 284 individuals. They froze assets worth over $400 million. But more importantly, they began to understand the scale of what they were dealing with. The CJNG cartel had not simply tried to distribute drugs in the United States. They had attempted to build a parallel government infrastructure that would eventually replace the legitimate systems in place. They had attempted to create a situation where law enforcement, government, and judiciary were all functioning under cartel command rather than democratic governance. The investigation revealed that Rafael Casso, the CJNG operative who had been communicating with Weatherby, was part of an even larger command structure. He reported to a cartel leadership council that met monthly in Guadalajara. The council had authorized a multi-year plan to establish secure distribution hubs in 10 major American metropolitan areas. Atlanta was the pilot program. The plan was working, which meant the danger was exponentially larger than anyone had first understood. Federal law enforcement responded by establishing a special task force dedicated exclusively to investigating cartel infiltration of government and law enforcement. The task force was given priority access to resources, funding, and personnel. They began working backwards from the Atlanta case, trying to identify every government official and law enforcement officer who had received suspicious payments, made suspicious decisions, or had shown patterns of behavior consistent with cartel influence. The investigation would expand to become one of the largest anti-corruption operations in American history. The human cost of the CJNG cartel's operations in Atlanta was staggering. The medical examiner's office reported that fentanyl overdose deaths in the city had increased by 340% in the 18 months that the cartel's network had been operating at full capacity. 312 people died, mostly young, mostly poor, mostly invisible to the city's wealthier neighborhoods. The cartel had flooded the market with fentanyl pills so cheap and so accessible that they became an epidemic. Families destroyed. Neighborhoods transformed into open-air markets. Schools dealing with an entire generation of children experiencing trauma from parental addiction and loss. The human trafficking component of the operation added another layer of horror to the investigation. Agents discovered that the cartel had been using migrant smuggling routes to move not just drugs but also trafficking victims. Women and men brought across the southern border with promises of jobs who were instead forced into labor, sexual slavery, and drug distribution. At least 147 trafficking victims were identified during the investigation. Many of them had been held in the same warehouses where narcotics were stored. They had been transported in the same vehicles. They had been treated as commodities, no different from shipments of cocaine or fentanyl. One victim, a woman named Maria who had been smuggled from Honduras with promises of restaurant work, was found in a safe house with physical evidence of repeated sexual assault. She had been held for 16 months. She had been forced to help package fentanyl pills. She had been told that if she tried to escape or contact authorities, her family in Honduras would be killed. When federal agents found her, she was so traumatized that it took her weeks to speak. When she finally did, her testimony would become one of the key pieces of evidence in the racketeering case against Deputy Mayor Weatherby and the other cartel operatives. By the end of Operation Redline, the final tally was sobering. 578 kilograms of pure narcotics seized across all raids. $139 million in laundered cash was recovered and frozen. 219 individuals were arrested, including 21 law enforcement officers, 3 government officials, and 4 high-ranking CJNG operatives. 347 separate charges filed. 147 trafficking victims identified and placed in protective custody. Over 8,000 hours of digital surveillance material analyzed. 17 criminal enterprises dismantled. A shadow government infrastructure exposed and eliminated before it could fully take root. But the operation also revealed a truth that federal law enforcement had been reluctant to acknowledge publicly. The cartel infiltration of American government and law enforcement was deeper and more sophisticated than anyone had understood. It was not random corruption. It was not isolated individuals making bad choices. It was a deliberate, well-funded, long-term strategy by a multinational criminal organization to systematically compromise the institutions designed to stop them. Power does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it only needs silence. Sometimes it only needs ambition. Sometimes it works through the small decisions of individuals who convince themselves that a little compromise today will not have consequences tomorrow. A police officer who accepts money to look the other way on one shipment. A city official who authorizes a contract that is slightly suspicious. A judge who accepts a favor for a family member in need. These are not dramatic moments. They do not announce themselves as the beginning of the end of democracy. But they are. Every small compromise is a brick in the foundation of a larger betrayal. The Atlanta case became a template. The methods used to expose Weatherby's operation became the standard for investigating similar infiltration in other cities. The task force expanded. More officials were arrested. More corruption was exposed. The Department of Justice launched public awareness campaigns about the dangers of cartel infiltration and the critical importance of government transparency and accountability. The case also prompted congressional hearings into the funding and resources available to federal law enforcement for combating organized crime at the political level. New legislation was introduced to strengthen whistleblower protections and create additional oversight mechanisms for monitoring government official behavior. Deputy Mayor Samuel Weatherby stood trial 9 months after his arrest. The case lasted 6 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. Encrypted communications with Rafael Caso. Financial records showing millions in cartel money flowing through his accounts. Testimony from corrupt police officers who had worked directly under his command. Testimony from trafficking victims. Testimony from federal agents who had documented his interactions with cartel operatives. When the jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with a guilty verdict on 87 of 93 charges, there was no surprise in the courtroom. Only a grim confirmation of what everyone already knew. The system had been compromised. The system had been rebuilt to serve criminal interests. And it had taken federal law enforcement months of intensive investigation to expose it. Weatherby was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge, in issuing the sentence, called it one of the most egregious betrayals of public trust in the history of this court. The other officials and law enforcement officers arrested in connection with Operation Redline received sentences ranging from 5 years to 25 years, depending on the extent of their involvement and their willingness to cooperate with ongoing investigations. But the most significant consequence was not the sentences. It was the revelation of how vulnerable American government institutions really are to infiltration by well-funded criminal organizations. It was the recognition that the line between legitimate government and criminal enterprise is thinner than most people want to acknowledge. And it was the understanding that defending democracy requires constant vigilance, constant accountability, and a willingness to acknowledge threats even when they are inconvenient or uncomfortable. This story matters because it reveals something that most people do not want to see. The cartel did not try to take over Atlanta with military force or public confrontation. They did it with money and patience and strategic placement of people who had more ambition than integrity. They built a system. It was working. And if Operation Redline had not happened, if Marcus Webb had not made that phone call about those encrypted drives, if FBI cryptographers had not cracked that code, then Atlanta might have become exactly what Deputy Mayor Weatherby and Rafael Caso intended, a cartel-controlled city with all the appearance of legitimate government but all the function of a criminal enterprise. That is the real danger, not the violence, not the drugs flooding the streets, not even the overdose deaths and the destroyed families. The real danger is the quiet transformation of government into a tool of organized crime, the systematic replacement of public servants with cartel operatives, the redesign of institutions to serve criminal interests instead of democratic ones. The investigation into cartel infiltration continues to this day. Federal task forces are working in multiple cities across the country, trying to identify and eliminate the same patterns of corruption that were exposed in Atlanta. Some of what they are finding is alarming. Evidence that the CJNG Cartel had attempted similar infiltration strategies in at least 8 major American cities. Evidence that hundreds of millions of dollars had been invested in this strategy. Evidence that the campaign had been running for years with minimal detection or opposition. But there is also hope, because the system, despite its vulnerabilities, still has mechanisms for accountability. It still has federal law enforcement officers dedicated to rooting out corruption. It still has citizens willing to report what they see. It still has judges who will hold people responsible. It still has the capacity to recognize threats and respond with force when necessary. If you are still watching this story, then you have seen what happens when a cartel stops hiding in the shadows and starts wearing the uniform of the law. You have seen the scale of the threat. You have seen the consequences. And you have seen that the response, when it finally comes, is comprehensive and unforgiving. Like and subscribe if you want more investigations into organized crime and political corruption. Comment exposure if you want cartel infiltration dragged into the light and held accountable. Share this story because it matters. Because it shows that the battle for control of American cities and the American government is not theoretical. It is real. It is happening. And the outcome depends on whether people remain vigilant or turn away. This has been a fictional dramatization inspired by real law enforcement operations and the genuine threat posed by cartel infiltration of government institutions. All names, officials, and specific operations described are entirely fictional and created for storytelling purposes. But the patterns described, the tactics employed, and the dangers exposed are based on real investigative practices and real concerns within federal law enforcement. The threat is real. The response must be real. And the vigilance must be constant. Because power does not always announce itself with explosions and violence. Sometimes it only needs silence and ambition to reshape everything we thought was secure. This is the story of Operation Redline. This is how the underworld tried to become the government. And this is how federal law enforcement stopped it.